When Earl Bakken was just a toddler, he was already fascinated with electricity. He couldn't stay away from wires, cords, plugs, and connectors. By age 9, he had figured out how to build a telephone system using scavenged wire from a blasting operation and his grandmother's earphones. Today, Bakken is recognized throughout the world for his work in developing life-saving medical technology, beginning in 1957 with his invention of the first wearable external cardiac pacemaker. Through his leadership, he helped launch the modern medical technology industry, enabling millions of people with life-threatening illnesses to be restored to full life and health. He has been associated with IEEE since 1948, was named a Fellow in 1970 and a Life Fellow in 1990. The Institute has presented Mr. Bakken with countless awards over the years, and his cardiac pacemaker was named an IEEE milestone in 1999.
The IEEE has meant a lot to me over the years. From the time I was young, I wanted to be a member.
Many factors influence a person's career choice: innate talent, insatiable curiosity about a subject, authority figures, even the movies.
Well, Frankenstein was what really turned me on as a 9-year-old, was all the lightning and all the flashing of lightning. But the story of bringing a person, restoring life to a body, so that immediately said, I want to be an electrical engineer. I want to play with lightning like that.
To Bakken, Frankenstein was a stunning illustration of life restoration by electricity, what he called his career dream. This then became a deep spiritual calling, an understanding of his purpose on Earth.
I made things like a taser to keep the bullies away because I was a nerd. I had a Ford Spark Coil and got 20,000 volts out of it. And I made a robot that wielded a knife and smoked cigarettes and all sorts of things that were not the healthiest things. And my minister, when I went through confirmation, said, you shouldn't be doing some of those things. You should somehow find a way of using electricity to help people. And so that's what stuck with me. My wife was a technologist, medical technologist at Abbott Northwestern Hospital. And I used to pick her up after work, and I'd get there earlier than before she was finished.
Earl had become familiar with the staff at Northwestern, and they learned that he was a graduate student in electrical engineering at the University of Minnesota. Soon they began asking him to repair electronic hospital equipment. Hospital engineers could service heavy machinery, but were not trained to repair more delicate laboratory equipment.
Hospital people didn't have engineers that could repair colorimeters or flame photometers or some of the more complicated vacuum tube equipment. The hospitals were bringing this equipment to radio shops. Radio shops were not much good at doing quality work on medical equipment.
While talking one day about his part-time work at the hospital with his brother-in-law, Palmer Hermansley, the two men soon realized that there was a need for a business that could repair such equipment, and that was the genesis of Medtronic, the company they formed in 1949. Medtronic had a modest beginning. Its first location was a 600-square-foot garage in northeast Minneapolis. The new company had a slow start. Its first month in business, Medtronic grossed exactly $8 for the repair of a centrifuge. During the second year, Earl and Palmer began representing several medical equipment manufacturers in the upper Midwest, and Medtronic started to grow. Bakken discusses those early years.
It began that so often someone would ask, isn't there some way we could modify this piece of equipment to do a little different process? Instead of being just an amplifier, they'd like an integrator. And back then it took a whole row of vacuum tubes to do an integration. Now you can do it on a chip. And so we would get involved with the physicians.
One of those doctors was Dr. C. Walton Lillihigh, a pioneer in open heart surgery at the University of Minnesota Medical School. At that time, Dr. Lillihei and other surgeons discovered that heart block occurred after corrective heart surgery in about 10% of their cases. Silk sutures used in patching the defect interfered with the heart's electrical impulses, causing abnormally slow rates that were not sufficient to carry a patient through recovery. Dr. Lillihei needed an engineer familiar with electronics to make sure the 4-channel recorders were operating correctly and that the pressure gauge used to monitor patients' blood pressure was calibrated accurately. Earl was the only engineer at the time that would join the doctor in the operating room.
He started in 1954, came up with the idea of doing open heart surgery on blue babies, babies that have a interventricular septal defect. And then they found that when they sewed a patch over this hole, the heart's conductive system ran right along the edge of the hole. At least 20% of the patients, the system conducting the signal from the atrium to the ventricle would stop working, at least temporarily.
For some time, in fact since 1803, physicians knew that electricity was effective in stimulating heart activity. However, the pacemakers built in the late 1950s were bulky, relied on external electrodes, and had to be plugged into a wall outlet. External electric shocks were frequently too traumatic for young heart block patients, and the AC-operated pacemaker could fail during a power blackout.
And this Lillihei wanted to do something about. And in physiology, they used a lot of grass stimulators with 3 knobs, one for duration, one for amplitude, one for frequency. Dr. Johnson said he had used this on animals and it triggered the heart. He said, why don't you try it on the babies? And so they did try it on the babies, and it worked. They kept the heart beating, and kids recovered in a few days and could be weaned from the pacemaker. And the grass stimulator is AC powered. Dr. Lillihei asked us if we could make a portable pacemaker.
By 1957, the research team discovered that by combining a pulse generator with a wire electrode attached directly to the hearts of dogs, heart rates could be controlled. Over the next few weeks, Earl developed a new kind of pacemaker that was not much larger than a paperback book. He borrowed parts from other electrical devices that he had in the shop. For the new device's circuitry, he relied on a design for a transistorized metronome he had seen in a trade publication. When finished, he had produced a pacemaker that was powered by mercury batteries, provided a 9-volt DC pulse, and could easily and comfortably be worn by young patients. The original Bakken pacemaker was tested in the University of Minnesota's laboratory. The following day, it was applied to a pediatric heart block patient. The effect was instantaneous. The pacemaker immediately restored the child's heartbeat to near normal. Within days, the child's heart resumed a normal rhythm on its own, and the pacemaker was removed.
And then you ask, is it good enough to keep the child alive? Is it reliable?
That was when Earl made the decision to stick with this design and began manufacturing his pacemaker.
I don't think the vacuum tubes were small enough, and they still had a filament, so you had to heat the filament in some way, and you just couldn't make them small enough or reliable enough. So we were lucky to use the transistors.
In 1958, the beginning of pacing adult hearts began. No one could have imagined the future for this device, originally intended just for blue babies. But by 1960, the focus was changing to include temporary use on post-surgical adults. By then, the company had around 6 employees who built pacemakers while continuing to do repair work. Bakken realized it was time to focus on dropping the repair side of the business and developing a safer pacemaker. It also meant rethinking the external model.
when this is external, you have a wire in through the wall, the heart, and you have oozing around the wire, and you worry about infection, and even though several thousand were used, it was always a problem. And so you began to think, isn't there some way of putting it in the body?
In the United States, the first successful attempts at designing a totally implantable pacemaker were reported by doctors William Chardak and Andrew Gage at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Buffalo, New York, and Wilson Greatbatch, an electrical engineer. The three men carried out more than 2 years of experimental work and testing before they recorded a milestone in the history of biomedical electronics: the world's first successful long-term implant in a human patient of a self-contained, internally powered pacemaker. Greatbatch had heard of Medtronic and wanted to use their leads because they lasted longer.
There were a lot of objections to putting something in the body. You know, some of the major religious groups said it was not proper to put something in God's temple. It shouldn't do that. But people started ordering them. Well, it's, of course, now well over 10,000 a month and growing.
Bakken, now in his 8th decade and a resident of Hawaii, believes that while there is much to be learned in the fields of science and technology, there is a balancing force that permeates life. Maybe it is not all a question of science and technology. He's working to bring awareness of this balance into healthcare, treating patients as whole individuals. Their body, mind, spirit is the future of medicine.
It's a different kind of medicine. It combines high technology and high touch, the human caring. So what I've promoted there now that's starting to move around the world is blended medicine.
Since developing the first wearable external cardiac pacemaker in 1957, Medtronic has been the world's leading producer of pacing technology. Today, it is the world's leading medical technology company, providing lifelong solutions for people with chronic disease.
It's so fulfilling. What better can you do something for life than to have every day someone is coming up to me and thanking me for saving their life, or their uncle, or their grandparent, or their child. And I didn't do it, you know, it's the employees that did that. 7,000 engineers that we have working here. So it's a very fulfilling career to be in. I can't think of any better.